I think it's getting quiet. Everyone nervously awaits the last session of this wonderful conference. Thanks a lot, Tommaso and Pauline, for organizing that, for all of the BCCP team. So far it has been fascinating. And I have the pleasure now to open the last part, the policy roundtable part of this conference. My name is Hans Friederiszick. I'm a director of E.CA Economics and a research fellow from ESMT. I have been also in earlier times with the European Commission, there with the chief economist team, so a competition economist by training. I have the pleasure to guide you through this 1.5 hours which we are having. The plan is that we will touch upon again some of the topics which were discussed in earlier panels and bridge a little bit between the issue of market power, potential competition policy solutions which are proposed right now. You may have seen that there's an increasing list of policy papers and reports with tremendous intellectual man and woman power and intellectual power going into that. Being recently published, being at the report, the so-called Fuhrmann report by the UK or for the Treasury of the UK Treasury, as well as the report of the European advisors on digital markets, Jacques Kremer and further authors, as well as the recent Stiglitz Center reports. So there's a lot of ideas flowing around on how competition policy could address some of the problems which we were discussing before on market power, and we will discuss those during our policy roundtable. Clearly, we will also then bridge over to data protection and even bigger topics like media diversity and how those two areas are connected and whether they are connected, in fact, and whether the solutions which we are proposing for competition policy are also helpful in that field. To discuss this very interesting, fascinating, and pressing questions, I'm happy to introduce the panelists. There are 4 panelists, and let me start to the very right with Amelia Fletcher. She's a professor at the University of East Anglia, at least for me specifically known for her long tenure as chief economist at the British Competition Authority, OFT at that times. But she holds also an extensive list of non-executive director positions, being it at the CMA, the Financial Conduct Authority, and the Payment System Regulator. Most recently, she has contributed as one of the signing authors to this UK report, the Fuhrmann report, which is making specific proposals to the UK government how to regulate or how to adjust competition policy enforcement given the challenges of digital markets. The second panelist is Stefan Hunt. He is Chief Data and Technology Insights Officer at the CMA, so the British Competition Authority. So more hands-on and in the current practice of enforcement. I understand the unit is doing both, helping to develop and find good solutions, technology solutions for better enforcement, but also being involved in the cases and giving insights on how to best do competition policy enforcement in digital markets. Beside his PhD in economics and impressively from Harvard, he also holds a bachelor degree of experimental psychology. So here we are moving already a little bit out of the traditional antitrust economics field into behavioral economics. So Stefan, also great to have you with us. To the very left, and balancing our panel with respect to the gender mix, is Marit Hansen. She's a State Data Protection Commissioner of the Land Schleswig-Holstein. This position she holds since 2015, but has been as a deputy commissioner on that role for a long time. She is also a member of the Data Ethics Commission, which is advising the German government. And by training, she holds a diploma in computer design. So we have now an economist and psychologist, and a computer designer in the legal field. In the legal field, even better, and that gradually brings us to Paul Nemitz, who is a lawyer by training, and he's principal advisor at the Directorate General of Justice and Consumers since 2017. He has been also director for fundamental rights in the same directorate, and led here the reform on data protection in the EU and the discussions with the US. With deep knowledge on that topics, he is also a visiting professor of law at the College of Europe in Bruges. So, and with that introduction, we would start that roundtable. Structure-wise, the idea is that each of the panelists will give a short introductory statement, 5 to 7 minutes. And then we will have a guided discussion here on the floor for another half hour or 40 minutes. And then we will open the discussion also to you. With that, I hand over to Amelia.
Okay, thank you, Hans. So I thought that I would just say a little bit about the Furman review that I was involved in and where we came out. Fortunately, actually, a lot of the analytical work that we did in terms of how digital markets work, what the economics of them are, and why they have this very strong tendency to tip to being highly concentrated. Essentially, Fiona talked about this morning. So, and it's there's a lot of analytical similarity between the Furman report and the Stigler Centre report, which Fiona led on. So what I'm instead going to do, given I have 5 to 7 minutes, is just talk about two of the main areas of recommendation from our report. Interestingly, our report, unlike the Stigler one, was commissioned by the UK Treasury, and that has a major plus, which is that government and the CMA are committed to at least considering quite carefully where to go next with our recommendations, and I'll just tell you what seems to be happening there as well. So the first area of recommendation that I thought I would talk about is on merger law, and essentially we identified, as others have identified, that we couldn't prove it, but there was pretty strong evidence in favour of the view that there had been under-intervention in merger space. There'd been, for digital platforms, there'd been kind of 400 mergers involving the top 5 digital players over the last decade, 250 of those in the last 5 years. Very few of them had even been reviewed by competition authorities, partly because of the nature of mandatory merger notification regimes and turnover thresholds. Even where they had been reviewed, they hadn't been really reviewed in very much depth. They hadn't really addressed the key concerns. And in fact, it hasn't been mentioned today, so I'll just mention that the Lear report that the CMA commissioned, and in fact was led by Tommaso Duso, who you heard from earlier, has now very much confirmed, I think, our views in that report in terms of what that did when it looked at a series of digital mergers and how they were analysed at the time. And it confirms that essentially the competition authorities missed a trick. They didn't really look at them in enough depth. So we make a number of recommendations in the mergers space. The first one, which has been fully accepted by the CMA, is that the CMA should really prioritize the scrutiny of digital mergers. They should be calling these mergers in. They should be giving resource to them. They should get specialist resource in if necessary. They should be looking at them from all different angles, including how they're monetized, thinking about harm to innovation, thinking about the potential competition, thinking about all sorts of different counterfactuals rather than necessarily just the status quo as the only counterfactual. So that the CMA have said essentially they're already doing. They've already learned that lesson. So that's very good. And indeed, the CMA has got a number of digital mergers that it's either recently decided or is reviewing in detail at the moment. The second area was more contentious, and this goes a little bit to the issue that was being discussed earlier, which is about the growth of economic analysis within antitrust and the concern about whether, as we've placed more weight on evidence of harm, actually we've kind of made it too hard to actually intervene in cases and in mergers. And the particular issue that we were looking at in digital mergers is that in the UK, at least, we have a standard which is more likely than not. So you have to say that a substantial lessening of competition is more likely than not, so over 50% likely. And we kind of with our economic hats on, thought, well, hang on, think for instance about Facebook, Instagram. You know, at the time, with what we knew at that time, yes, there was some possibility that Instagram would be a competitor, and perhaps the only really serious competitor. Let's say, for example, there's a 25% likelihood that they were the most serious likely competitor to Facebook, and if that was true, that would be really, really bad to allow that merger. But let's say it's a 75% likelihood that, you know, it's fine, merger's fine. If you're an economist, you say 25% likelihood of really bad and 75% likelihood of meh equals that's a merger you should block. The law does not allow you to block it because you haven't hit the 50% likelihood of harm. So we said that we thought there was a good rationale for going, actually, if you're going to use more economics, going the whole hog and essentially taking more of an expected value approach. We called it a balance of harms approach. Interestingly, we got hit from two sides on this. One side said this is completely impractical. How can you possibly expect to do this? The other side said, this is what happens already. We just kind of do it kind of under the covers, as it were. So we said, okay, well, the main thing is, A, we need to be clear, and B, we need to be making sure one way or another that these sorts of mergers are where it's almost impossible to get really good enough information, but there's a very real likelihood of real problem, that we should be able to block them. So that is ongoing. No one's committed on that one, but I have to admit, it's not looking that positive for that recommendation. The recommendation that's looking a lot more positive was the recommendation to introduce what we call a digital markets unit, which is essentially an ex-ante regulator, although we didn't say exactly where it should go. It could be its own regulator, or it could be within another body. Why did we say that we thought we needed that? First of all, we thought we looked hard at ex-post antitrust law to think about whether it was the solution to some of the dominance problems and exclusion problems that we're seeing and market tipping problems. And we concluded that it was inherently incapable of dealing with the sorts of problems that we were seeing, partly because there was too much. There were too many issues, actually, for the competition authorities to deal with. Competition authorities naturally kind of get a hopper of cases, but then they have to narrow them down and narrow them down and narrow them down until they get a case they actually think they're going to get through the courts. So what you get is a few very specific, rather odd, sometimes, cases that don't necessarily allow you to create really effective deterrence, because it's not obvious quite what the rules coming out of them are, because they're kind of odd and nuanced, and you can get two different cases that look very similar coming out in different directions. We didn't think the fines, despite being huge, were necessarily sufficient to create deterrence. We thought the remedies, which had to be proportionate to what you'd found, were inherently backward-looking, overly narrow, and really not doing the job we wanted. And above all, we actually said that on the basis of the economics of these markets, these are markets that are likely to tip to being monopolies, even without the sort of bad behaviour that ex-ante competition law is about. And so actually, if you want to try and create competition in those markets, you may have to be more proactive. And in particular, the sorts of things that might stop markets with very strong network effects from tipping are things like interoperable standards, open standards, that allow, for example, different parties to all interact. So if I'm on one platform, I can communicate with another platform, and that reduces massively the power of the network effects to make a market tip. Can allow more between platform competition. Likewise, multi-homing can be a very valuable way of stopping markets tipping. If all consumers and all business users are on all the platforms, then actually the network effects are nullified and markets won't tip. So we said, okay, so we may need to be more proactive in pushing multi-homing and pushing open standards and pushing the ability of consumers to just interoperability generally. So we recommended the development of this Digital Markets Unit. It would have 3 objectives. The first was to basically identify certain platforms as having strategic market status. So the very kind of biggest of platforms that are really important in this space. And then agree some core principles of conduct with them. It would be a participative approach. We would talk to them and other stakeholders, come up with some high-level principles, and then pin it down to what it means for each individual platform precisely. It would be a participative approach, it would be a code of conduct, but then once agreed, there would be monitoring and there would be sanctions for breach. So it would be a powerful form of regulation. And the sorts of things that would address are things like self-preferencing, fair treatment of business users on platforms, and anything that was designed to limit, for example, multi-homing or interoperability. So anything that was designed to penalise business users, for example, for using multiple platforms. So that's one area which is closely linked to ex-post competition law, but not the same as. The second was about having an objective to promote data mobility and interoperability and open standards. And that's really to go beyond, and it wouldn't just necessarily be for the biggest platforms. We would be to try and design markets more effectively such that you could have multiple platforms all competing alongside each other. We have experience of this in the UK from something called open banking, where it's still quite early days, but we are requiring that the banks provide access to consumer transaction data with consumer consent, but that would allow consumers to bring their data on an ongoing process, on an ongoing basis to another platform, so that they can have their bank, they can have another place they can get their data, and it's all up to date, and they've got full consent and control over it. But that enables you to have multiple players providing certain services to consumers. And we want to basically stretch the idea more widely across the economy. So this regulator would look at different use cases. And the third thing is this idea about data as a crucial input in some of these markets, particularly new markets. As AI develops, you need to be able to train your AI. Data is crucial to being able to train your AI. The players with massive data banks are therefore necessarily, in a way, at least for some use cases, in a better position to be able to develop the next generation of AI. if you want to create more competition, therefore, you need to find a way to let new players with new use cases come in and access that data. Obviously, you can't just open all data to everybody for GDPR reasons and other reasons, commercial incentive reasons. But on a proportionate basis, we thought this regulator should have a pro-competitive objective to thinking about use cases where data access should be provided. And the Prime Minister, who we still just about have, last Monday announced that it was looking all sufficiently positive that it would be taken to the next stage of being thought about, this regulator. So, and there's a lot of thinking going on. So it's actually looking interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, fascinating. Thanks a lot, Amelia. And if there are no pressing questions, I would propose that I hand over to Stefan.
Thanks, Hans. It's really good to be here. I should start with the usual disclaimer, as I'm in the trenches, as Hans pointed out, doing day-to-day work, that these are my views and not necessarily those of the Competition and Markets Authority. So changes in the nature of competition, especially digital competition, are changing the work of authorities. Authorities absolutely need their regulatory structure, their powers, and the remedies that they consider to adapt, as outlined by Fiona this morning and Amelia just now. What I plan to speak on, however, as someone who runs an analytical department within a competition and consumer agency, is how, in parallel, trends in markets are leading authorities to adapt their analysis and the capabilities of the people that they employ. My view is that to bolster their capabilities for the digital world, authorities need to equip themselves with new skills. They need at least some data engineering and data science, by which I mean machine learning and artificial intelligence, as well as some behavioral science capability as well. So what I'm going to try and do over the next few minutes is explain why authorities need these skills, focusing first on how the increasing trend of digitalization has implications for the use of data engineering and data science, and then second, on how the interaction between consumer protection policy and competition policy, especially with the increasing prominence of digital platforms, and again, as Fiona really focused on this morning, has implications for the use of behavioral science. So first, data engineering and data science. So firms, especially digital firms, are now washed with data, and access to data and digital infrastructure, such as cloud computing, are really changing what firms do. The largest tech firms, as we all know, Google and Facebook, combining so many different types of data, they have incredibly rich views of us, our preferences and our behavior. We see a massive change in the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Firms personalize our experiences on the internet. So when you go onto Facebook or Instagram, what you see is personalized just for you. It's been curated. Firms are also using algorithms to at least try to deal with hate speech and other whole variety of different online harms. And firms are doing much more besides with these technologies. Also, firms are experimenting on a scale like anything else before, with A/B testing in some firms, literally running into hundreds of thousands of experiments per year within that firm. Now, as authorities, we need to understand what firms are doing. We need to monitor and analyze what they do, and these actions can vary minute by minute or can be differentiated across hundreds of millions of consumers. So, for example, as an authority, we might need to scrape data from price comparison websites to identify potential most favored nation clauses, say, or analyze price differentiation, or conduct analysis using very large data sets that we collect from firms. These tasks all require the ability to gather and manipulate data efficiently and effectively. We might also need machine learning capability ourselves to understand what platforms should be doing. How should Facebook be identifying and removing hate speech? Or Facebook groups that organize negative online reviews for competitors. How should Facebook be identifying that? And this requires data science, the ability to use machine learning. Lastly, as outlined earlier by Fiona and just now by Amelia, the set of remedies that we need to consider for digital companies is increasing. We might need open standards and interoperability, data mobility and data openness, as these remedies require deep understanding of what's technically feasible. For example, we might need to assess whether allowing a certain type of data openness is actually going to be okay in terms of data protection, whether there might be some re-identification. From an adaptation of regulatory powers perspective, we may need a new unit or agency with ex-ante powers to conduct analysis. Now, from an adaptation of regulatory capability perspective, I believe that we need competition and consumer agencies to be employing data engineers, and data science to help them in the work that they do. Now, second, let's move to competition and consumer protection policy. One of the questions we were given for this panel was why competition and consumer protection policy have become strongly interlinked and whether they're going to integrate more. So my answer to this question is that once we build a rich understanding of consumers into our economic model, basically integrate psychology, we realize that competition policy and consumer protection policy cannot be clearly separated and in fact need to be considered often in tandem. In other words, when consumers struggle to make choices that are in their own best interest, this actually alludes to what Matt was talking about in the last panel, we need to consider consumer protection interventions in tandem to complement traditional competition remedies. This is true in many traditional markets, such as financial services, energy, or telecoms, but behavioral considerations are also particularly important in digital markets, as, for example, outlined in the Stigler Center report. So the Microsoft Internet Explorer case from 2009 shows how consumers can accept choices by default, in that case, their choice of browser, and how this can have large effects on competition and the outcomes for consumers. The importance of defaults for consumer choice in focused on browsers again was really important in the Google Android case. In the Google Shopping case, we see that the power of salience and the importance of being at the top of rankings is much, much more important than any rational model could explain. To solve complex digital issues, such as understanding consumer preferences for how their data is handled, I think very diffuse preferences, and for data privacy and data protection, I believe that we're going to have to similarly understand consumer psychology quite deeply. In these cases, dealing with the consumer protection issue, the difficulty in navigating choices is, or at least can be, in part and parcel of dealing with the competition issue. And when designing remedies, specifically, we need to think carefully how consumers make choices and design remedies that comprise open competition. Just like I believe the excellently designed active browser choice remedy for the Microsoft Internet Explorer case, at least in the US market. Now, another one of the questions that we were given for the panel was whether consumer law was adequate. In the UK, we take the view that even otherwise capable consumers lack the time to understand how to protect themselves from exploitative conduct. And there's a pervasive feeling that markets haven't been working for consumers. There are calls for a fundamental rethink of the principles and purpose of competition law and policy. We believe that ensuring public trust and confidence requires the CMA to be a more visible and vocal consumer champion. From adaptation of regulatory power standpoint, that's why we at the CMA are currently pushing for further consumer powers to sit with our existing powers. From an adaptation of regulatory capability standpoint, I believe we need competition and consumer agencies to embrace psychology, design, and behavioral economics, as well as more traditional analysis to make markets effective. Now, to be clear, I'm not advocating in the slightest for jettisoning economics or econometrics. Economics still provides the right framework or the analytical framework for thinking about many of the issues that we've been talking about. And econometrics provides core analytics capability. But my conclusion is that trends in markets are having a number of impacts, and one of them is that authorities need digital and behavioral analytical capabilities, and that we're going to need to invest in them further.
That sounds like a revolution, Stefan.
I don't think so. I think quite modest and integrated within, but I think you can get a lot of return to making those investments.
Okay, wonderful. We will come back to that topic in a second. But with that, I hand over to Marit, and I think you have some slides brought with you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm a stranger here because of computer science and being in the legal field and data protection. And therefore, I was asked in the preparation phone call to first of all say what are our tasks. And then I thought, you will get the slides, but only look now as quite as a teaser or motivation to check out data protection, because there's so many interesting parts. Look at the arrows. The red arrows. Look at the markups, at the boxes, because otherwise it's much too much. And let's start. Here you are. Setting, we are the Data Protection Authority Schleswig-Holstein, which for the Germans I think is quite clear. We are the very northernmost, but for the others we are there. The General Data Protection Regulation was was set up for harmonization purposes. It should be the same for total Europe. And still there are many possibilities for opening clauses. That means that the member states may treat specific things differently, for example, the employee data protection. But in general, I think it's the right way to go, otherwise the market would not work. And we have experienced that because in 1995, the previous regulation, or that was a directive, had the identical aims, but it was not so much in a success. And therefore we believe, although we have 1 year of experience and not so much has changed for the better, we believe that there's a potential for being a game changer. Look now only at the red things, the market location principle, the certification, the fines and sanctions, and the court rulings. They will, of course, affect business very much. But also here, the data protection by default. And we heard already some people mentioning defaults that are not changed, and they will influence a lot, and we will have a small look into the law in a minute. It's much too much to go deeply into the GDPR, but think here of fairness is one of the major principles, and this is the same for business fairness as well, and accountability. So there has to be one person, or in this case, the company or the service, the public service, they are responsible. They have to be accountable. They have to prove that everything is legally compliant. But we see on the other hand that the defaults and some methods in design are not very much data protection friendly or even invasive. And meanwhile, this is from 2018. There is not data protection by design as a result from this study, but deceived by design. And the so-called dark patterns make people to reveal more than they want to, that the apps are very greedy, that the patterns, the psychological user interface patterns, work against the users. And therefore, it's very interesting also for us, because we have so few psychologist people in our office. Mainly they are lawyers, and some are computer scientists, some very few economists. But we need more understanding in how people are tricked into behaving in a different way. And this is what we have been talking about here as well. There are so many rights. Only what is now interesting, the consent that has to be withdrawable with the same effort or non-effort as giving consent, which is new. So if you click, it should be also only one click to withdraw your consent. Not very often in reality right now. The information that you have the possibility to get and understand what is happening, still it has to be very easy, it has to be a simple language, it has to be understandable. Of course, we don't find it yet, but we will see some improvements, I think, in the next time. Also with machine readability, that's another story. And the right to data portability, was mentioned already by Amelia, to take out your data, here it is, to take out your data which you provided anyhow, and put it to some other provider if there's competition. So if there are other providers who can pick it up, and also if there are standards that the data is meaningful for the other company as well. Okay, then the fines, of course, there are very high fines, which was, I think, the main reason for visibility of this regulation. And you see here, in general, each fine has to be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. So people should learn from that. And how much is it? Yeah, 20 million euro, or 4% of the total worldwide annual turnover of the preceding year, which can be a lot. Still, is it theory or reality right now? I think it's a little bit trying out. But of course, the maximum will probably be used for the maximum cases, for the most infringing cases, which are very difficult to prove, which need so much effort to be very good in preparation. Otherwise, the court would say, so crap, it wouldn't work that way. And you see here what is the maximum. There are two kinds of fees, the fines. And this one, the higher one, is also if you have infringement to Article 5. This was about the principles, fairness, for example. But of course, again, if there's a very generic and a very common principle, is it really something where you can say this has to be fined? So many people criticize if it's too general, then probably a fine is hard to defend before court for the data protection commissioners. Okay, then one thing, ECJ case, it was a very, very small case in my area, so I'm before the European Court here in this case of Justice. In 2011, there was one Facebook fan page, and we have discussed Facebook here as well, a Facebook fan page, and they didn't know how it was working, what was collected as data, they had no idea about that, and they didn't inform the users. We are now in the old law, in the old legal regime, but still we are now discussing what is the ruling of the ECJ. And is the person, in this case a company, is the company responsible for what is happening with the user's data, with this data subject's data, if they are providing a fan page? You may say, fan page. Of course, it's Facebook's responsibility. Who else? Otherwise, you small fan page administrators will probably not influence what Facebook is doing with the data. So there were different possible answers to that. No, they are not responsible. Or yes, there's something where the controller has to make sure that the processor, who is who, is behaving adequately. Or is it something where they both, the fan page providers, each one, and Facebook have joint controllership. This is something which we knew from the European law from 1995. The Germans had missed to transpose this, so we didn't have it in German law, but nevertheless it existed. And it still exists in the European law. Don't read now what is here, but primarily the Facebook controller, the box, is the responsible entity, but the fan page administrators also take part in determination of purposes and means, which means they are also controllers. They are co-responsible for the data processing that Facebook is doing. This is the ECJ ruling, which means it's a joint controllership and there is no gap in the responsibility chain, meaning now everybody who is having a Facebook fan page, not as a private person, but as a company or a public service, they have to make sure that this is a legally compliant service, that they are making use of that, which is not a big surprise, I think, but in fact it is. And from last week, we have here Sachsen-Anhalt, Saxonia and Anhalt. They have left Facebook in the public service last week. And I think it's a good thing if the public service acts as a role model, but of course also the companies. I know of Rewe, they are discussing very in detail with Facebook how Facebook should change, and Rewe is quite big. So there are chances by different business models and for different business models. For example, if those who are making use of that, who want to present themselves, who use this kind of infrastructure, if they pay for that. So, which is no surprise, because if I use a good service, usually a company has to pay, a public service has to pay, and get some guarantees that the address is not gone after next week or so, that the availability is there, and whatever. But if this is now some payment service for those who are professional users, not the private people, let's exclude them, then of course only for legally compliant service, otherwise they must not use it. But if we have different ideas of legally, if we have competition, so alternatives, and they all have to grow first, without being paid, it's so hard. It's so hard to have an alternative thing to Facebook if there's no fair payment. And therefore, I think this may be the right thing to offer for all these Twitters and YouTubes and Facebooks and so on, to offer something which is in Europe legally compliant and has built-in privacy. And of course, also the others, the smaller ones, that they can profit, because the companies and the public service has to calculate in their usual budget that they want to be visible in these platforms. It's not a minority position anymore. It is something which has to be demanded by each controller according to the GDPR. And the last thing on the defaults, the starting point has to be data protection friendly presettings, whether in Internet Explorer or wherever, as a starting point. If people then want to disclose more, want to be personalized, want to be tracked, understand that it may be a value for them, perhaps also activating and deactivating this, that may be fair. But only to do that already in the background, and this has been done for the last decades, this is not compliant with Article 25 in the second paragraph. Reality is different right now. but please, if you find that, complain, so ask them to change, inform your regulator, because this leverage has to be used. Now we see a big gap between reality and the law, and also the code. I'm a computer scientist, and business. So I am trying now to interest you in this topic, because we need now more bridging and getting the solutions into the real economic, psychology, and so on systems. It is demanded by GDPR. It has to be demanded by the controllers, and this joint controllership will be the dominant constitution, the dominant institute in the internet world. Usually, everybody profits a little bit, but this means all have to take part into being legally compliant. Is it now a game changer? We can evaluate that only after a few years, but the promise is having a level playing field. And we are working on that, and I hope everybody is helping. And of course, having the alternative system, the competition, the good ideas that they can conquer, that they really have a chance on the market and are not, because of the network effects that cannot be made gone. So this is not possible. That can be a little bit, well, perhaps that we can try by promotion, by other systems or so, that is not so bad as it is right now. Otherwise, alternative systems don't have any choice. And therefore, we need this shoulder-to-shoulder standing together with consumer protection and with antitrust regulators. Thank you very much.
So thanks, Marit, for this very firm statement that data protection and antitrust seems to be clear complements. I think we will touch that issue again. It's not always so clear, is it? There are sometimes also trade-offs. And let's see whether we can explore them in a second. But first, let me hand over to Paul.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to the interdisciplinary nature and the transatlantic nature of this seminar. I think that's exactly what we need today. I would like to share with you my personal view on these matters and a thesis, which is the following. I think we need a very holistic view on the power of the tech platforms. And I think it's quite a dramatic issue, because this technology has, at least theoretically, a totalitarian potential. And this totalitarian potential we see in its use in China. And the German philosopher Nida Rümelin, who published a book called Digital Ethics, former Minister of State for Culture, he said recently, the regressive dreams in Silicon Valley and Peking, they are really very similar. So because of this potential, I think it is very important to have this holistic view on the issue of power, and I see 6 sources of power which we must look at together. The first source of power is money, and money in politics is always a problem. And these companies have huge amounts of money, and they use it everywhere. Not only for lobbying. We now read that in Washington, 50 million a year, 238 people are lobbying. In Brussels, it's the same. In Berlin, Paris, London, and every capital in Europe, it's at least a triple whammy of lobbying, the companies themselves, their trade associations, and the American embassy. At least that's how I experienced on GDPR, always very coordinated. But also, the money is used in all areas of building public opinion. We make friends with journalism schools, we help them a little bit, we finance journalism projects, the Google News Initiative, 150 million. We are everywhere in science where internet and society is studied. If you go searching in Berlin, in Oxford, in London, in Harvard, Berkman, everywhere you find money of the GAFAM, and sometimes it's easier to find, and sometimes you need to search a little bit more. And then, of course, in the dialogue with politics, we don't only lobby, but, if Mr. Schmidt, when he visited the economics minister in Berlin at the time, he brought along an incubator, which was then built in Berlin. And if we discuss with Munich about open source, we bring along a research center, and then Munich decides no open source, we use Microsoft. So I think this issue of money is big, and it needs a holistic, cumulative view everywhere these companies use money to influence public debate, science and journalism. Second, their technological grip on the public discourse sphere, the electronic public sphere. I see it a little bit, let's say, less relaxed than some of those who have presented here. Because at least in Germany, the statistics are maybe a little bit different, but for under 30, the internet platforms have now become the main source of political information according to the Grimme Institute. And I would say when we look about the public electronic sphere, we can not only look at the information people give, how they feel, we feel more informed. We have to look also at the objective reality of competition between the platforms and the press. And the reality, as I read it, is that newspapers are dying. The plurality of the press goes down, and one reason is that 80% of the new online advertisement goes to 2 companies, and this is the same in America and in Europe. That's Facebook and Google. So Facebook and Google compete with the press for the money of advertisement and for attention in the political context. And I think that is something which also has to inform the debate when we're talking about their impact on democracy. The third point was mentioned by Marit. These companies know everything about everybody, and data profiling is very prolific. And let's also not forget the states, in Europe the same as in America, is also very data hungry. Police and Secret Service, I was myself part in leading the Snowden investigation of the Commission. The private-public surveillance complex is not harmless. And so data is a source of power. It's a potential source of blackmailing people. And it certainly has a chilling effect, and the Court of Justice of Europe said it very clear on the Data Retention Directive. If people know that all their telephone calls are logged, they will think twice whether they make use of their fundamental rights. And the same is of course true if they know that they are being constantly logged by private companies. So it has, I would say, at least on part of the public, certainly a chilling effect if this data collection is just moving on. And in many cases, as Marit just said, the practices are continuing to be illegal. This will change over time, but we need a little bit a more hard-hitting tradition, and I think it's good to have these seminars also so that, for example, data protection authorities learn from the competition authorities how to hit hard, and I absolutely don't share the view that fines have no impact. These guys, they don't change certainly without fines. I mean, fines are not enough, but if you don't use fines, and if you don't do that, okay, you have one less tool. So I think it's a little bit, cloud cuckoo land to think that this can all be done in self-regulation and, let's talk nicely with each other. They are not going to do it. 4, I think we have to look a little bit harder at the innovation, at the cutting edge of technology. For example, I'm asking myself, are there others than these companies which are able to put AI together in working systems, which really perform on the market? What I read is that they spend incredible amounts on AI, that what I hear from professors who are teaching machine learning, but also cognitive computing and so on at MIT and at the Californian universities, that they suck up the PhDs at incredible prices. And in contrast to old times, these PhDs, they don't tell their professors anymore what they're doing. The professors who remain at the university, I mean, some of them, they've really told me they're very frustrated because when they were young PhDs, they went back to the university and told their professors what they're now doing in the private research or in government research today. Absolute silence. Don't talk about it. And so I think this innovation concentration on AI in particular in these companies, there's at least as much a transparency problem as there is on their internet operations as we discussed them before. And then 5th, what we have discussed, of course, competition issues. And I would say, as I've heard in the room, it's a good thing. We have to think about behavior also which is below the level of what today is considered illegal. if you look at the mass buying up of potential technology which could be competing or having alternatives, or the imitation of this and killing it through imitation, these are things which, given that these companies are already so powerful, are a problem both, I think, for innovation, but also for democracy. So these are the 5 sources which I think we have to see together. And I think a debate on, let's say, one needs, of course, within each area of law to have the very serious work drilling deep. But from a political point of view, if one wants to be effectively doing the right thing in terms of regulating these companies, and I will say in a moment why I think that's how we have to move forward, I think one needs to have a holistic policy approach covering all these bases. So a last word on, is it the law, or can we leave it to ethics, self-regulation, and nice talking? I would say this. In a democracy, the principle of essentiality prescribes that when matters are so important that they either touch on fundamental rights of individuals or they are going to the essence of the good functioning of the state, for example, the functioning of democracy, then this is a matter which must be dealt with in a parliamentary law. Because democracy means that the important matters are dealt with by the forum of democracy, which makes the laws, which is the parliament, through legislation, and that we don't cut out parliamentary process. And I would also say that these matters must be addressed in a form which allows the enforcement also towards those who don't want to play ball. Because we cannot introduce in our democracies at a time where we talk about the crisis of democracy and the downfall of democracy, all the literature we now read about America and Europe, and this is a problem. There is a problem, it's true. We talk about the crisis of democracy, and at the same time we preach instruments which cut out the democratic lawmaker. So I think there we have to show color, and we have to go head on with the ideology of global technology, the unbroken internet, and so on. This ideology, if you think it to the end, and I've heard in the afternoon the moderator say the unbroken internet, most important principle, well, I would say, what does it mean for democracy? Does it mean we cannot have democratic decisions anymore if they touch on the unbroken internet? Do we really want to implement John Perry Barlow, Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, or do we want to implement our constitutional settlement, where we have promised our people that if they vote, it makes a difference in the world? So I think in the end, what we are discussing here at the beginning of this already progressed century is who rules. Is it democracy, or is it technology combined with capitalism? I think that is the big issue on which everybody has to take position. And I would say, let's not take up the fashion, which is now a fashion in America, where Congress cannot deliver laws anymore. And I have lived this myself. When I negotiated with my colleagues the GDPR in Brussels, we went often to America, and I talked to people in the White House, Danny Weitzner and so on. And President Obama had tried twice to bring through the Privacy Baseline Act, but he couldn't, because Congress is just not delivering anymore. And my view on this whole debate of self-regulation is this. In America you have, and here, but it comes from America, you have 2 schools. You have one school which is the classic, cynical, neoliberal, no law is always better than a law. Let's not be bound by anything. That's no news. But now, because of the inactivity of Congress, and because Congress is so much in the hand of money, look at Lawrence Lessig's studies on money in American politics, there's another school which I would call the good-willing, desperate people. And what are they desperate about? They're desperate about democracy not delivering, and they're saying, but this technology must have rules. So therefore, if Congress is not developing, if democracy doesn't work, let's at least do self-regulations, let's do ethics codes, and so on. And these are the good-willing people. This is the good America, which I find extremely inspiring, which does extremely good work, and which are the best source for thinking critically also about all these tech absolute trends. And combined with these two sources of motivation, the cynical neoliberal and the good-willing, let's do something even if democracy doesn't work, they come to Europe and they preach their gospel. And I would say this, democracies in Europe, in contrast to America, they still work. They are able to deliver binding laws. And let's invest in this capability, and let's also go back to America and help our friends there to revive their democracy. I'm very much looking forward to the presidential campaign coming, but I don't think it's a way forward which we should follow, which is to say, well, this is good, it works in America, and we do it too. I think we should invest in democracy, and we should use the tools of democracy, which is lawmaking, because laws are the most noble expression of democracy, and this is true both on the European level and also on the national level. And the example which was mentioned here of the Netzdurchsetzungsgesetz, the net enforcement law in Germany, is a very good example to show what a difference a law can make. Because I negotiated on the European level the Code of Conduct against hate speech and xenophobia. And, wow, the companies comply with it. And we do regular reporting on this, and, great. But why do they comply with it? Do they comply with it because they're nice and because of journalistic pressure and so on? No, they comply with it because they don't want to see other member states doing a law, like in Germany, the Netzdurchsetzungsgesetz. That's why they comply. If Germany would have not made this law, my prediction is the rate of compliance would be much lower. And the reason, and I was very close to this process also here in Germany, the reason why this law was passed in the last meeting of the German parliament, the Bundestag, before they were dissolved for elections, was only one reason. Everybody knew this is not an optimal law. But the reason was to answer the question, who rules here? Is it the lobby activities of Facebook and their community rules, which they write, or is it the democratic lawmaker here in Germany? And only for that reason, this law went through in the last meeting in a pretty emergency mood. And so I think with all its failings, it is very important that democracy doesn't give up on trying to come also to the necessary compromises which you need in law to regulate these companies. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Paul. I'm thinking we're a policy debate panel, so let me be a little bit provocative to the positions held here on the panel. I mean, we are living in extraordinary times. I have personally experienced a level of innovation I think my father has not experienced with the internet bringing in so many new services and capabilities to me, which is amazing. And with this dramatic revolution behind us with artificial intelligence, the next one is already in the pipeline. So it's a fascinating time to live in. We see that the giants are investing heavily in R&D. Tremendous amounts are invested. We hear they are transferring variable cost and fixed cost, which I think is fantastic for the delivering of new technology and new ideas. So if we would have had this panel 2 years ago, wouldn't most of the people have subscribed to this kind of position? I see an extreme tipping in the policy debate with respect to that area, and I just would like your opinion. Do we really have a market power problem here, or are we now over-regulating, overdoing, and bringing in old philosophical ideas of controlling, regulating, and building a new superpower regulator in the field of digital industries?
So our Facebook cases from 2011, 2 years ago, of course, we are on the same, from my perspective.
Oh, the consumer protection units were always a little bit ahead.
We try to perhaps, but usually it's very, very difficult.
No, but I would say there were a number of wake-up calls. So the first wake-up call was, of course, Snowden, where
2013.
where we realized, what this technology actually is about. It's a two-sided technology. It's total surveillance, big-time private-public partnership, and so on. Then I think the next wake-up call, or one of the wake-up calls, was, at least also for me personally, the incredible efforts to fend off GDPR. The American Chamber of Commerce, they put out a study saying you will lose 5% of GDP in Europe and so on. Brussels has never seen a lobbying storm like this. And so at the time, that was, quite amazing ingerence into our democratic process. But, fine for me. I'm of the opinion we should be as interventionists in terms of bringing our ideas to America as Americans are to bringing their ideas to Europe. That's why I like this kind of conference, can encourage everybody, go to California and preach, spread your views. And it's very important to go to California because some of the big players like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, they don't even have an office in Washington. So that's the second wake-up call. And the third wake-up call was the Brexit vote. Now that was not a little technical thing about, poor Facebook, they're carrying the load of the brand and, it was everybody else's fault. Well, when we read in Brussels the report of Westminster, the Culture and Sports Committee, basically the Brexit vote was stolen because of Cambridge Analytica's usage and, the wrong usage, yes, but using the data and capabilities of Facebook. And that's not small fry. So, we are beyond talking technical detail of competition law, this and that. We have here a historic vote which changes, the peace constellations in Europe, Great Britain leaving the peace deal after the Second World War. And it was brought about, according to the British Parliament report, by the usage of this technology. Maybe abusive usage, but it's clearly related to this technology. And it's unreversible, as we see now. It's irreversible. And that's not a thing which we can discuss only on the level of, technical issues of law. So I think we see here, and also in China, the social scoring and so on, we see the big world change potentials of this technology. And I am always willing to admit I'm a great user of Google, I tweet like hell and so on. The positive potentials, no doubt. But we have to work on the downsides because they are existential.
I see that point, and Amelia, I see your hand rising, and I will help it raise even more. Because, what you're saying here is Snowden, GDPR, and Brexit. I hear that, but this has nothing to do with competition policy. Amelia, and I heard also from the earlier talk here that the question of plurality and diversity and news reception is not really closely related to the element of concentration. It's the other way around in a way. People go to branded names, platforms, to protect themselves for fake news. So there seems to be a negative or a true trade-off between concentration and the objectives of informed citizens. Amelia, is it then we are throwing our competition law stuff in because we have a problem on consumer protection and democracy issues?
Well, no. I do agree that I think the popular feeling about platforms has been changing a lot because of online harms, democracy, terrorist financing, all sorts of things that have changed the popular conception of whether platforms are kind of on our side. But actually, if you look at the competition stuff, I think I saw a slide of all the complaints that were in front of DG Comp about 8 years ago relating to the major digital platforms at that time, and there were hundreds of them. So many complaints because there were very serious concerns by, at that point, players that were still in existence but worried about being squeezed out, that they were being squeezed out by the behaviour of the large digital platforms. Most of those players are not there anymore to be reminding us that they were complaining. So I think there was a huge number of cases. Now, some of those players, it is probably fair to say, were squeezed out because they weren't as good as Google. And there's always specious cases that are taken to competition authorities saying, they're better than me and I'm going to lose out because of it. But I'm sure there are a whole set of very credible and serious cases there that, and DG couldn't take all of them. But certainly that was a long time ago. I think the other thing that has changed, though, is at that time, I think there was still a stronger feeling amongst competition policy professionals that these markets were tippy, which is what I said earlier. So there were network effects and economies of scale and scope, which means they tend to tip to being concentrated. But that if they were tippy, they might remain tippy. So that actually you could get players who had very large market shares suddenly disappearing, and people kind of quote Nokia phones and MySpace and Friendster, if anyone remembers that. But actually, so there was a feeling that actually there may not be too much competition in the market, but actually that didn't matter because these markets were contestable and there was competition for the market, and any dominance would be very, very short-lived and indeed promote more innovation. So it's this kind of Schumpeterian creative destruction story of innovation. I think that although some of that possibly still happens, I think there's a greater feeling now that you cannot rely on that sort of argument to protect consumers, to protect innovation, because actually we're seeing an awful lot of very, very embedded market power, and lots of the things like access to data and the infrastructure that these players have mean that they're there for the longer term. So I think that has really, I think that's really changed. One just thing that I don't think said enough on the democracy debate, because you said earlier that these platforms, the digital advertising platforms, in particular Google, are very, very powerful in kind of grabbing advertising revenue. They are grabbing that advertising revenue from people that actually make content to some extent. So actually, there is an argument, at least, that their dominance in that position, is extracting more revenue than would otherwise be the case from the news providers, and therefore harming the ability of the news providers actually to provide independent news, and that is also not good for democracy.
Good. Thanks a lot. I mean, still staying a little bit with competition law, and I understand here, Amelia, that I mean, many of the provisions we are putting in are going to the direction of becoming more interventionist. So there are proposals of lowering the standard. There are elements of behavioral economics, which are always prone to the criticism everything goes if we don't assume rational consumers. And with the balancing of harm approach, clearly you're not only assessing the likelihood of the merger being pro or anti-competitive, but also bring in some judgment about the value of one over the other, which is a completely new assessment for competition authority and gives you much more room for maneuver as an agency. I understand we are discussing that within the context of digital markets. It may be justified if we think about the nowadays bad guys. To my times it was Microsoft, now it is Amazon and Facebook. But I guess we also have to apply it to all other industries. So I'm just asking, are we going one step too far by those kinds of proposals, and are there risks of becoming too interventionist in our approach? Is it like a pendulum? I mean, first doing nothing and now doing everything.
Yeah, I mean, there was a pendulum before that, as you'll be aware, before the Chicago School took hold, when probably we did too much. It was over-interventionist as well, competition policy. So there, it swings. I think when we were doing the Furman review, we were actually very concerned to not make any recommendations under competition law that were digital specific. And the reason was, where's the border of digital? I mean, everything in the end is going to be digital one way or another. And we thought that you'd just end up in court fighting over whether something was digital or not, which would be just a whole lot of waste of legal time. Therefore, we said anything we recommend, even if it is motivated by thinking about digital platforms, has to be justifiable more generally. And we thought actually the balance of harms point that we made, while it came up in the context of digital platforms, we thought it was actually a good point generally. And we heard this morning about actually we think there's been under-intervention in mergers right across the piece, in brewing, in airlines, in lots of areas. So actually we felt justified. Now, I can't tell if we're going to swing too far the other way, but I think at least some degree of swing is definitely justified.
Yeah. Stefan, to bring you in on that one, but give me also the chance to have a little bit an add-on question to that one, but please also comment on this one. But I mean, you were pointing to the fascinating new methodology which we can bring in, machine learning, and doing all the testing on big data sets. I mean, it was already, I think, something like 2 years ago when I was speaking with the chief economist of Amazon, and he was saying, wow, we are building up the largest empirical I/O PhD team ever seen in the world. And he was speaking something like, I think, 90 to 100 PhD economists being the planned number in his team. So I just wanted to hear your vision about how your unit is developing and to counterbalance that.
So I think Amazon have reached about 150 PhDs, actually. So nothing like that. So actually it comes back to the end of when I was speaking. I said, I just think we need to be integrating these skills because they actually are highly complementary to the core economics and the core law. So you're not just suggesting that in the slightest. You still need an economic framework for thinking about the variety of different welfare effects and balancing them and trading them off. But I think there's, and from my experience so I was in the financial regulator for 8-9 years before transferring over to the CMA about a year ago. Certainly for people working within agencies, data engineers and data scientists are just so much more efficient at doing a whole variety of different data tasks. Then it can be slightly different in academia, where you have very specialized sort of PhD researchers who can teach themselves really, really good machine learning methods and these kind of things. In practice, that's not going to happen in an ordinary financial regulator or competition authority. So it's really valuable to have these skills. And a lot of what we're doing is actually, some of it's pretty sophisticated machine learning models. A lot of it is sort of kind of mundane or taking away from mundane tasks. But actually, when you turn it into a machine learning problem, it's actually, for my team, it becomes a much less mundane task. We're just helping the rest of the organization. So it's not necessarily always going to be about grabbing large data sets. I think actually in some ways that can take you down a rabbit hole. But I think you need the capability to do so, and you certainly need to be able to use data more effectively. In terms of the behavioral side of things, I still think you have to fit that within the economic framework. Yes, you say anything might go behaviorally. Well, yeah, that's probably true in theory, but I don't think we're dealing in the world of theory. We're dealing in the world of kind of fact and reality. So you have to figure out what's going on in a particular setting and make sure you have the right kind of understanding to actually appreciate how consumers are actually making decisions and build up to the extent they don't already exist in the academic literature, build up empirical facts. So I think you probably on the psychology side, you only need, or psychology and design, you need a relatively small number of individuals. And again, it's just about fitting those kind of skills into the framework. So for example, when it comes to remedy design, really making sure that actually if we're going to intervene in markets, increasing the likelihood that we're going to not have unintended consequences and affect things in the way that we want to affect them. So I certainly think we need design, then we're going to need some experimental capability as well, which is what firms do after,
And
sales.
I understand from the reports in general that there seems to be also pressure being built up that we need a specific regulator for digital markets. And I would, first of all, hear a little bit from you, how you see your unit and whether this is something which is growing into something which could be seen as a digital regulator. And Amelia, I think you were proposing in your report such kind of a unit. Is that then complementary to a unit in a competition authority? And eventually I would also like to shift over to your side then. How do you see that interaction with this kind of competition policy unit or a regulator? How important is that to also support those consumer protection or even democracy goals? I think in some of your earlier papers you were pointing your finger, Paul, to an enforcement lack. Clearly, I mean, competition policy is enforcement strong. What are the benefits there? But eventually, quickly running here around the room, and then I think we have to also open questions to the floor. So
there's many parts of the CMA that get involved in thinking about digital policy or digital cases. Really from across the whole gamut of the frontline, the antitrust or markets or mergers or consumer protection as well. So we're providing the analytical capability or certain types of analytical capability, complementary to others. I do think it's quite relevant to thinking about the kind of skills that will be needed within the digital markets unit, whether that's in the CMA over potentially at Ofcom, which is another, or being standalone. I think wherever this digital market sits is going to need a bunch of these analytical capabilities. But if it's elsewhere, the CMA itself is still going to need its own capabilities in this kind of space as well. So I don't think it's just this unit going elsewhere. No, well, we're certainly just part of the picture, though I think it's an important part, especially when it comes to actually a lot of the remedies that Amelia was talking about, really making sure we've got the capabilities to understand those quite technical interventions.
Amelia, your view, we need that ex-ante regulator, is it?
So we deliberately didn't say where within the UK system we thought the ex-ante regulation should sit, because we saw pros and cons of a number of different options. But I just wanted to mention that one option was to sit it with something that has also been recommended in the UK, which is an online harms regulator, which goes back to the debate we were having earlier. And I wanted to just, because it didn't come up, and I wanted to just highlight it, that we have a white paper in the UK which would impose on the digital platforms a duty of care which would compel the companies to take reasonable steps to keep users safe and prevent other persons coming to harm as a direct consequence of activity on their services, which I think is a really interesting. It's not about democracy, but it is about harm to individuals arising from platforms. And that is looking, again, in the UK, very likely to happen. If that happens, there is then a question about whether it makes sense to sit that with the competition stuff as well. It's all the same players. It's quite a different issue, but as we've been discussing, there are some very close links. So that's I think in the UK, one of the difficult discussions that's now happening is what are the links, which is exactly what we'll be discussing today. What are the links between the online harms agenda and the competition agenda? What are the skills that you need to be able to deal with both of those sets of issues? And therefore, would it make sense to keep those together, or would it make more sense to give the digital competition stuff to the CMA because they understand competition?
So I definitely I do have a view, on a more specific view on that. Is I tend to think if you're going to get your hands on, whether it be online harms or competition, actually, there's a lot of domain expertise that you need to build up, really understanding how platforms works. I think that tends to push to putting these things together. Again, just my personal views. Then also, when it comes to the kind of teams that I run and them building up their ability to use various different types of web scraping capabilities or other forms of monitoring, or might be other technologies, I think there's a lot of benefit to having those focused on, be it online harms or competition on the same set of platforms. So I tend to think from just a practically how would you do it perspective, I tend to think it pushes in that direction.
Marit, you agree to that one?
Yeah, so I think the domain expertise is very important, and therefore I don't believe in having one digital or whatever regulator, because we have to have all these skills that are relevant to the individual domains at the regulators, but the skills from technology, for example, have to come in. And this is now a cultural problem. I'm one of the technology people in data protection since 1995. There were years I was very alone. Nobody understood me, and still it's happening. And of course, nobody pays as good as Google can. Therefore, the public service is more and more. So we are here debating companies, but the public service cannot be a role model if it's so much reliant on what is happening in the business world. And of course, they can demand more, and I think they should demand more. But anyhow, they have to control. And this means they have to know how to ask the right questions, how to check, are there possibilities, but this influences design. For the very innovative parts, there may be some, like research, of course, some open questions, but if it's really something what is on the market, if people can buy it, the checks, how to check that it's correct, should be implemented as well. And then it becomes easier to really regulate that. And then I believe, let's keep the regulators, at least in Germany we have so many, let's keep them, but equip them with the right skills, with the right people, change the cultural gap. That will be probably the hardest one, that the public administrators accept the technology people and vice versa. But then it will make sense. And otherwise, without coping with the digital world, understanding that the youngsters also, so my kids in school, are not the nerds only because they know how a computer functions, but that it's common sense, then probably it will get better.
Paul, how do you see that?
Yes, well, I would say theoretically the US, of course, has a great advantage because in the FTC, theoretically, it does competition, consumer protection, and data protection and privacy matters. It's, of course, subject to the decision of the commissioners. It's all very political, but I think as integrated structures are more likely to address the issue. And I'm starting to become a little bit itchy about what we've built up in EU law, which is, for every piece of legislation, the member states build up their own regulator. So we have now telecom regulators, obligation by EU law, we have data protection authorities, we have equal opportunity bodies, consumer protection and competition, and it's getting a little bit much. And I would say, to start also a scientific discourse about thinking of how to best organize for the digital future. Now people say the European Parliament made a resolution and said we need an AI regulator. The UK now digital. I mean, it's getting a little bit much, and I would think there is merit in thinking about why do we need actually this fragmentation? If you think about criminal law, to go to another area of law, and I'm a great friend of thinking in the overall coherence of the legal system, the public prosecutors have huge scope of responsibility.
And it doesn't work.
Well, I mean, that the head of one of the 18 data protection authorities in Germany is not a great friend of integrating things. Okay, I can forgive that. But of course you need specialists. But the advantage of a unitary structure is that you can move the specialists quickly around, you can adapt inside one organization. So I think a good discourse about the need to bring together, to increase coherence and also structural change will certainly also be an incentive to existing regulators to start to work together more constructively. In Germany you call this Amtshilfe. Yeah, that you help each other, and if one has the competence, then if the other does the investigation, you talk a little bit with each other. So I think we need a little bit of hot seat for those regulators out there who, of course, all of them will speak against integrating it. But I think from a public policy point of view, there is a need. Why? Because the internet, digital, and AI, these are general purpose technologies. They will be used all over the place, and they will be the key drivers of anything, and to have all these fragmentations, I'm not sure it is the structure for the future.
I do rather agree with that.
I think it's solvable with what I said.
Yes.
because if we have the standards, like you also said, we need some standards for that, then it's easier to cooperate. And of course, that should not be redone. And the federal system, of course, has also its pros and cons. let's leave it there.
We are coming to the end of our session, but I still would like to, I think we started 5 minutes late, so we should give 5 minutes to the audience. So if there are, I see many questions out there, so that's fantastic.
To the audience.
So let's give 10 minutes to the audience. If I may start here in the front, please, eventually there.
Yeah, in the spirit of generalised agreement, I would just like to say something about this skills point. I see it, the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK is really kind of been leading the way here. They've set up a AI working group, which many, including the CMA, are on, where they kind of work out the things that regulators are working together on. And that really is, I mean, as you say, almost everything we're talking about is connected with AI or related technologies. But the other point is just to, and I mean, for that reason, I don't think a new regulator for online harm, I think that's suffering from the problem that the politicians want to have a shiny new big regulator of all of their very own, rather than kind of facing the complexities of regulation. But there is a slight tension there, which I would just raise with Paul, which is, I mean, and this was a problem with the UK parliamentary report as well. It's just a kind of, you know, it's a volley of anger and a kind of against Facebook principally. That and the parliamentary report, I mean, not necessarily you, but I mean, the fact is that our law isn't fit for purpose. You can't just regulate these, apart from competition policy, you can't just regulate these companies. You have to regulate something. And our electoral law, the way we run elections, is really challenged by AI and these digital platforms. And we have to rethink things and go back to scratch with regulators like the Electoral Commission. We can't just sort of take it off and just do it with the technology.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think neither should you have regulations which are specific to this or that company, nor indeed should you have regulations which are content regulations, with the exception of the good European tradition that we regulate content which is a problem for the democratic discourse, like, you know, incitement to violence, hate speech, using of the swastika and so on. There we have a little bit a different tradition to America. But apart from that, of course, you know, in the freedom of the press ranking, freedom of speech ranking, Europe is far beyond, before America. We don't need lessons from America about free speech. We're doing this quite well. And we have an external court in Europe, the European Court of Human Rights, which controls that free speech is fully complied with inside the member states of the European Union. America doesn't have this. So I'm a little bit, you know, itchy when I hear, you know, the great lessons which Facebook and Google people in particular love to give about freedom of speech, you know, how great they are and so on. Well, you know, freedom of speech is also inhibited by doing nothing if, for example, female journalists or you know, are trolled and are threatened on the internet. And we also have politicians who do politics as an honorary office. We have mayors in East Germany who step down because they can't have it anymore. And Facebook and Google, they're doing shit all about protecting them. And that's just not on. That is against free speech and against democracy. That's not possible.
There was another question. Yeah, please.
Yes. From my part, Marie-Sophie Held. I'm advisor for the Green Group in the German Parliament, so representing the legislative power here. And I have two questions to Amelia Fletcher and another more philosophical one to anybody who wants to answer. First, interoperability as a possibility to create more competition. Where would you think that can be employed apart from messenger services, which is a no-brainer? Second, have you discussed unbundling, one of those 400 scrambled eggs that we have scrambled in the past years? Yeah, shouldn't we talk about unbundling some of those companies? And the philosophical question is more about, we heard about the negative consequences of market power and markups with regard to inequality of wealth as well. And don't we have to define competition law broader in a sense of also protecting some kind of wealth distribution around within a society, or making sure that wealth isn't concentrated as much along with market power excessively, instead of just redistributing afterwards. So basically curing with competition policy those rule origins and not just the symptoms by redistributing.
Okay, thanks. Amelia?
Okay, so on the interoperability and example, interoperability takes many different forms. So, for example, open banking, which I described, is a bit like interoperability in that it's the consumer, the data goes freely between the services, and therefore the consumer doesn't kind of use one to talk to the other, but it uses one or it uses the other, and they're talking to each other. So that's a form of interoperability that is not as obvious as if I ring you on a mobile phone, but it is going on. I mean, there are some really interesting. We didn't look at all the possible use cases. What we wanted was the regulator to be ready to accept use cases and think about them. It's interesting that when we started thinking about use cases, we did end up running into GDPR, because actually Fiona earlier on talked about it would be great to have a social network data mobility, so that you could have a different social network, but you could still see what all your friends were doing on Facebook. You know, that would be great for competition. But your friends on Facebook may not have given their consent for you to see it on a different platform. So I think there is a real a risk that GDPR would prevent that from occurring, which we didn't get into the tensions between GDPR and competition, but that is potentially one of them. So what can actually be done in practice is not absolutely clear. But I think what we determined, and messaging is another one, what we determined was that we thought there would be use cases. We were also very influenced by people that came and saw us. There's a guy from Mozilla who's very vocal on this, who said that essentially the internet was built on open standards. And when there were open standards, it was very, it was kind of like a level playing field, and everyone was very pro open standards. As the bigger platforms have got bigger and bigger and bigger, there have been gradual incipient emergence of more and more proprietary standards to create more walled gardens. And the more you have proprietary standards and walled gardens, the more likely the market tips to one ecosystem or another ecosystem, rather than having interoperability between ecosystems. So I think that, yeah, I'm not answering your question, but I'm absolutely sure there is an issue there, and that it would help. Oh, sorry, on the other issues. On unbundling, we thought that the UK deciding to break up Facebook was unrealistic, frankly, but we also weren't convinced that it was necessary. We thought we wanted to put in place these pro-competitive interventions and see if we could make them actually work. And if we could make them work, we thought that was a better route to go than to try and break these organisations up. But that kind of, I guess it's nice to have that as a stick in a stick there if nothing works. But I think there is a serious egg scrambling issue on inequality of wealth. This is one of the things we looked at within the Furman review. Was lots of people have said that consumer welfare standard is not the right standard for competition law. And we came out and said very firmly that we thought it was, although it needed to be looked at in a long-term dynamic way. One of the reasons for focusing on the consumer welfare standard is I think that does help with your inequality point, because it gives the more that you're driving welfare down to consumers, the more the overall, once you take into account who owns shares, et cetera, you're helping equality.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
So I'll add one thing. One thing people talk a lot about in terms of interoperability is the ad tech stack. So very many parts of it, certainly in the UK, it's 13 billion pounds a year, so it's a lot of money. And a lot of that is owned by Google. Actually, Facebook own a lot of the rest of it. And there's various different elements to it, and being able to actually connect for other firms, you had to connect into that could be really helpful for accessing ad revenue, or for advertisers being able to advertise. So that's one thing that's talked about a lot. In terms of inequality, yeah, absolutely, we need to be thinking about that. Certainly in the UK, we've been focusing a lot This is less of a dynamic issue, but focusing on vulnerable consumers. So lots of different markets where we worry about vulnerable consumers, right from WAMs in insurance markets through to energy, through to a bunch of other markets. So that's been a lot of active work. I think from what we're talking about today, it's really from a quite dynamic perspective. So we're worrying, I think, about having essentially wages be higher, having growth in the economy, and these kind of things. And I absolutely think there's a connection between what we've been talking about today and that as well. So yes, we do need to be thinking of that. I just want to give a bit more of a plug to working together as agencies. So Helen mentioned the Regulators and AI Working Group in the UK. So we're 17 different organisations, but we're just starting to think now about how we can work together. But I think there's a huge potential, especially to the degree that as agencies you start to be doing a lot of things within code themselves. Obviously, to the extent possible, if you can actually share the code that you develop in one organisation with another, that could actually be very, very efficient, right? Because we're not in competition, but it's not just domestically as well. It's also internationally. So we're speaking to quite a lot of the different competition agencies as well.
So one last question. I think then we really have to close that panel. I think there was one. Please, over there.
Thank you. Sebastian Dengler from Tilburg University. I have a question mostly aimed at Hansen, that you mentioned that the hope with the GDPR, with all these requirements put in place that people have to comply with, would be to level the playing field. Given the fact that it might be rather more complicated for a startup firm that doesn't have a huge amount of people already hired to actually put everything in place, are you really sure that that's actually gonna be the case, or are we maybe having another thing driving even more concentration into the market by having smaller firms face large entry barriers to actually be compliant?
Yeah, you quoted me as I hope, and then asked me whether I'm sure. So if I hope, it's obviously that I'm not sure. But I think that there's a good chance. And you're right, because for data protection guarantees, very often it's better to have some centralized services and central points of control. Where decentralized services often are harder to control for everybody, but very often data protection by design means you have to unbundle, to separate, to unlink, otherwise the guarantees are gone. And this is an open question, and I think the data protection designers are right now looking into that very much, that you still can have the guarantees without losing that. On the other hand, I quoted the dark patterns, so the trends in designing the systems are not necessarily according to the GDPR, and which means the dark patterns are more in the psychology area, but also with the messengers, that they want to stick only to their own their own protocol. And for example, if they provide end-to-end encryption and we want interoperability, very often the end-to-end encryption would not be end-to-end anymore in the current system. There should be gateways, but the gateways can be used by the law enforcement people and break up everything. So the guarantees may be gone. And if they're right now in Germany very much discussed, backdoors for that. And everybody probably is aware that backdoors for only the good guys won't work. See Snowden. And therefore, the design questions are very, very important. And on the other hand, how to start. So the design things I think are solvable, but they need more promotion for that. What about the user base? How to get the data that you really can go on? And this is more difficult, I think. There's one recital, 78 in the data protection in the GDPR, where it's said the producers, manufacturers, and so should be encouraged. It's only a recital, meaning nice to read. But how to encourage now data protection by design? And my parliament, I'm I'm the one going there and asking them. They, for example, support now Freifunk. So something where they wanted to discuss that people who are offering routers with some standards that are open and can be used by others, which is not so much data protection, but they have some bundles on data protection compliant routers, that this can be less, that they should be able to pay less taxes, for example. So we can put money on that to encourage or discourage other things. But the holistic view, I like that, which is, the word is nice, but having the solution is more difficult. We need this, I think, to understand the money flows. What about data access for the small ones and not for the big ones? When we also hear that Googles and others are saying, because of data protection, because of the high level of GDPR, we cannot disclose structural data of our user base, which is not true. The messenger thing, interoperability, of course, if there's a fair thing and giving consent and so on, people who want to reach out, they can, and the others don't have to. So I think there are so many solutions, but right now very often only the problems are discussed, and unfortunately this may not be the level playing field very near, and it's not decided yet. So we have to work together. So my hope is that you are inspired now to join the work to make it happen. Thank you very much.
Maybe a word on the small and medium companies. I think one has to acknowledge that the GDPR contains numerous simplification and exception rules for small and medium companies, and my suspicion, I can't prove it, but there is now some American literature produced for the American debate on data protection, which exactly sings this song, you know, the great barrier to entry for startups coming from GDPR. Now, that literature makes a lot of sense before the background of the debate in the United States whether Congress should pass a law which is like GDPR. So I think when you read that literature, look very closely at the facts base, look where the money comes from to produce that study. I would say, you know, I have not seen one of those papers which is convincingly showing, you know, 5 years ago we had the paper from the American Chamber of Commerce, 5% of GDPR you're going to lose. Now we have the paper, it's no good for startups. Well, I mean, you know, if we go through together through the GDPR, you see that basically, you know, if you're a startup, you don't need a fully fledged solicitor like some people claim in these papers, and you immediately go bankrupt because of GDPR. It's total crud. Yeah. So one has to be critical, and one has to know that money is flowing into studies. And we have just seen last week again a report about, you know, also a very knowledgeable European university which produces paper, and the word Google is not on the papers, although the money was flowing. So, you know, ask the question who has financed it and look at the context where the studies has been produced. I honestly, I don't know how you see it, Marit, but I think the storm of the claims, for example, in Germany also about the Abmahnwelle, yeah? This is completely invented, this wave of you know, competition cases based on privacy. It's an invention. It's very ideological.
It's a business model.
It's a business model, yeah, but it's just not happening. There are no empirics.
Yeah.
So, you know, let's be clear about the real world, that the fake news is not only on the internet, it's also in studies and, you know, very manipulative policy making.
So we are running out of time. Let me finish with the statement. Nobody here on the panel is paid by Google or Amazon. So thanks a lot for this very balanced and neutral discussion. So thanks, Amelia. Thanks, Stefan. Thanks, Marit and Paul. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.